Number 1. Grandma's house. I think that when you're scared of something, you might think that signs for it were there before an actual scary event happens. And what I mean is, if someone breaks into your house, afterward, you may remember having seen or heard signs of this happening before it did. But it doesn't mean that there was something really there. And I hope this makes sense. The reason I mention this is because of an experience I had when I was younger. It happened at my grandma's house. And my grandma lived in extremely poor and extremely rural settings. Looking back on the experience of being there as a child, I remember being very scared of her house at nighttime. During the day, it was a wonderful sort of place. It sat right between two hills with a creek running down the left side. There were many, many times that we would climb the hills around the house and go exploring as kids. It was really fun. But at night, it was the exact opposite. First off, it was dark. And I mean very, very dark. There were no street lights or anything like that. If you were outside and you wanted any light at all, the only light you had was a meager bulb on the front or the back porch. Inside the house was scary too at night. The house was so old, and the walls were so thin. Everyone went to sleep much later than I did, so very often I would be the only one who was awake for hours and hours, and I really would never get up and creep around the house because I was so freaked out by it. The room that I slept in was in the back of the house. All of the other rooms were a bit away from mine. The room was really small too. There was only really enough room in it for a bed, a small end table, and a tiny bit of space for moving around. The bed, therefore, was right under the window. The window faced the back of the house, and behind that house, there were some old sheds, a small garden and woods further beyond that. And of course, even if my grandma left the light on the back porch all night, it was highly unlikely that I would be able to see anything out there very clearly. On this night, I was reading a book, using a book light. There was not a light in the room or a lamp or anything, so the book light was the only thing that I had. I don't know what it was, but something got my attention late in the night. I looked up and out the window. I could have sworn that I saw someone, or something, moving back in the woods, by the garden and the sheds. I went back to my book. Like normal, I was a bit scared, as I always was when I was in that room, and I assumed that what I was seeing was simply something that was completely within my imagination. Not much longer, something once again drew my attention outside, and once again, I thought that I saw movement in the back. This time, I watched closer, hoping that if someone were out there, I would be able to see it. My heart began beating a bit faster. I was wondering if I was actually going to see someone out there, or who knows what it was that had grabbed my attention, if anything. I guess deep down, I really didn't think it was anything, but I kept looking. And then I saw it. Out of one of the sheds in the backyard, I saw someone emerge. It was definitely a person, and a person I did not recognize. He was tall and very thin, and he was carrying something. I rose up just a little bit to get a better look, and I guess at that moment, my book light appeared in the window, because suddenly the guy turned and looked straight at the window that I was looking out of. I quickly turned out the light, but after a moment, I saw that the form was moving towards the house, so I slipped down into bed. I took my body and pressed it up against the wall under the windowsill, so if someone looked in the window, they wouldn't likely be able to see me. and there I remained. I was scared to death. I didn't know who that was who had been in the shed, but I was positive that he had seen me. And while I lay there in bed, covered up and laying under that window, I just knew the guy, at some point, had to have been at the window, trying to look in, and see who it was that had caught a glimpse of him. I lay like that for a long time. I was too scared to look up at any point, out of fear that I would be face to face with the man, and eventually I fell asleep. Well, what happened was that my grandma had a moonshine still, and was well known for it. Every now and then, someone would break into her shed and steal a jug or two. The guy I saw that night was a hermit who had stolen from her before. I described what I had seen, and she gave me that information. I guess I really didn't think the hermit would have hurt me afterward, but it was still very scary when it was going on. Number 2. Hiking. Hiking has always been one of my favorite things to do. I got into it when I was very young because we lived out in the country. In fact, all of my relatives lived out in the country too, so for as long as I can remember, I always had plenty of space to explore. When I was at relatives' houses, I generally had someone that I was able to explore with. Whether it was cousins or second cousins, I had a lot of them. Almost all of them loved going for hiking trips. But when I was home, and no one would be over to visit, I very often went hiking on my own. I was an only child, and we didn't live close to any other homes, so I didn't have friends that I could get to come out with me. So for the most part, I would go hiking alone. Nowadays, I am, of course, a much smarter hiker than when I was young. When you're a kid, or at least if you were a kid back then, it was easier to miss certain things. Nowadays, I fully plan out my trips. I make sure everything is scouted beforehand. I bring along any equipment that I need. I plan on what I am going to do every day, and I make sure I only am out before dark. And a lot of that stemmed from the incident that I'm going to tell you about here. I was 13 years old at the time. It was my summer break off from school. I didn't care for summer break as much as most kids my age probably did. Not really having anyone my age to play with or talk to was pretty difficult. My friends from school all lived in town, and they were never too keen on coming back out to the country during summer. I only ever saw them on days when we went to town to go to the pool or for a baseball game or something. Both of my parents worked as well, so I pretty much had the house to myself during the day during the entire summer. So I went out hiking one afternoon. I got a much later start than I normally would have. I mean, it was sort of a spur-of-the-moment thing. I'd been sitting around the house all day. There wasn't anything on television I wanted to watch. I was feeling restless, so after a while, I just finally decided to go out. I took a little bit of food with me and some water. As far as supplies go, that was it. A lot of times, I would just head out into the woods. I didn't do that this time for some reason. I headed down the long gravel driveway of the house, then onto the gravel road that wove through the hills. I remember this so well, even though I haven't seen that house or area in so many years. I turned right. Our house was on top of a hill, and I began immediately following the road, walking down. It was an amazingly beautiful day outside too, since I had left so much later in the day. The sun was at an angle that caused the trees to cast a nice shadow over the gravel road as I was walking downhill. There were also blackberry bushes on the side of the road, and I picked from them as I walked along. Wild blackberries are probably the thing that I miss the absolute most about those hikes. What I was looking for was a good area to hop a fence. I wanted to explore a possible different area than what I was used to, so I kept an eye out for anything that looked interesting. After getting to the bottom of the hill, I walked along until the gravel road began ascending again, and that was when I found an area that for some reason was appealing to me. I had in fact picked out a really good area. There were so many different sights for me to see that day that I normally didn't get to see. For one, the leaves on the trees were thicker, so the area was much more shaded than usual. That alone made the hiking so much more comfortable. The thing was that I was so taken by the new scenery and so distracted by the cooler temperatures that I didn't really realize how long I had been out hiking. It wasn't until I looked up and noticed the sky was beginning to get that orange hue to it that I realized there was no way I would make it back to the area where I had originally jumped the fence from off the gravel road before it got dark. It wouldn't even be close. So I started back the other way, and I tried walking as fast as I could. I kept telling myself that simply walking fast would get me back much quicker than I thought that it would. Of course, this was simply me fooling myself. I had been out too long, and had hiked out way too far for that to be possible. And so slowly, it began to get dark outside. I cursed myself a few times for being so careless. Not only had I lost track of time, but I had also not brought a watch, or a flashlight, or anything that would have been helpful in the dark. And I would soon very much be in the dark. I estimated that I still had a few good hours of hiking to do when the sun had finally completely set. We didn't have a good moon that night. I began to get very scared as I saw how dark it was getting. I didn't know how I was going to be able to find my way off of that hill if I couldn't see where I was going. So I began walking slower, and little by little bit, I had to admit that I was beginning to see a little bit better in the dark. I don't know the explanation for it. Maybe the crescent moon was providing more light through the breaks in the trees than I gave it credit for. I mean, I wasn't seeing things clearly. The forest in the dark might be the scariest place I could have ever imagined myself being in. In addition to it being so difficult to see where I was going, the noises were very off-putting as well. Although I had lived out in the country my entire life, I had never been out in the woods as late as I was that night, so I was pretty aware of everything that was going on around me. Or at least I was trying to tell myself that I was. As I was walking around, I had to feel my way around quite a bit. I mean, it wasn't so dark that I was bumping into trees or anything like that, but small branches could hit me in the face and things like that, or I could have tripped over something. So I did my best to be as careful as I possibly could. "Come over here." I heard it, and at first I wasn't sure that I had heard it, although I did stop walking. I couldn't tell where it had come from, but like I said, I wasn't completely sure I heard it. But it did sound like someone told me, "Come over here." That time I knew I heard it. I had been thinking about whether or not I had already heard it or not. I should have just been listening so I could tell where it was coming from. It was a human voice speaking quietly. It wasn't a whisper, but I also was not able to tell where it was coming from. All I could tell was that it was off to the left of me and somewhat behind me, but I couldn't tell how far away the voice was. Plus, I didn't hear any sounds that sounded like a person was out there. I wasn't sure how long I stood there. I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared. I mean, it would have been different to physically see another person out there. I could have assumed it was a hiker, or maybe someone who owned the land. But this person was completely out of sight, and that couldn't mean anything good. I said, "Come over here." I ran. I didn't even mean to, and I didn't really want to. I mentioned before that I was scared to run in the woods, but I couldn't stop myself. I was too freaked out and way too scared. As I ran, branches hit my face, bugs flew into my eye. When the hill was going down, I started running way too fast and fell over myself. I tumbled down the hill until I hit a tree that stopped me. Getting back up, I continued rushing down the hill. I couldn't run all the way back home. Hell, that would have taken way too long, and I was not a marathon runner. But I made it to the road without looking back, and then I followed the road back to my house. The entire time I was worried. I kept expecting to hear someone talking to me out of the woods, or I expected someone to jump out at me. But fortunately, neither of those things happened. I still have no idea who it was that was talking to me that night on the hill, but I never had an experience like that again. Number 3. The Drive. The events surrounding this story are a little weird. You have to know a bit about me in order to know how I got myself into this situation. I was never interested in driving a car. I never had any desire to do it at all. When I was younger, my dad would spend more time with my older brother, teaching him how to drive and letting him drive. I guess that might have had something to do with it. Perhaps I saw driving as their bonding experience, and therefore it held no interest to me. So when I finally learned to drive and get a license, I was already in my early 20s. I really didn't understand everything either. I didn't know all the roads and such. Hell, the first time I got onto the interstate, I got lost. And that's actually what happened in this story. I had to drive to the city for a silly reason. I'd gotten liability coverage on my car, not knowing I needed full coverage since I had a car note. So when I called the insurance company about changing it, they insisted I drive into the city for an inspection on the car. So I drove down there. And although I didn't realize this on the way back, I actually took the wrong interstate back. And I really had no idea for the longest time. When I had been driving for over an hour, I figured that I must have done something wrong. However, I really wasn't sure what to do in order to get back. I was already scared of using these huge freeways before the night started. I felt even worse about it by this point. So I did what made sense to me at the time. I had taken a road out northwest instead of north. So I decided I would find an east road to take me back to an area that I was maybe more familiar with. I was so unfamiliar with the area. Being someone that had not been used to driving around much, I had no idea of the amount of cornfields in the area. Before I knew it, I was driving along on a dark country road through cornfields, having no idea where it was that I was going to. I kept thinking if I drove straight, I would eventually end up finding my way home, and I began to get a little panicky when it just seemed like these cornfields were going to keep going on forever. Although it was nighttime, I ended up passing by a farmhouse. The lights in one of the front rooms of the house were on, so I figured that I would get brave and go up to the house to ask for directions. So I pulled into the driveway. Now, I was nervous enough doing this in the first place, but I was also nervous due to the creepiness of the area. As I pulled up to the house, however, the strangest thing happened though. The porch light came on. A man came out on the porch and he was holding a shotgun, and he came walking down the stairs right at me. I wasn't sure how to react at first, but the man was walking fast. I got scared and quickly shifted the car in reverse. I began driving backward. The man kept after me though. He even began running, and by the time I got to the end of the driveway, he shot the gun. I didn't see if he was aiming at me or firing a warning shot or what. I mean, I know he didn't hit my car, but I was scared out of my mind. I got to the end of the driveway and drove off. I followed through with my before strategy of just driving east. I kept doing that, and eventually I made it home. I was so shaken and frightened by my experience, but I did feel better when I got home and got into bed. Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment to let me know what you thought of the video, and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.